Hey everyone, my name is James and welcome back to Chippy Gaming. So today it's finally time for a nostalgic look back at Terraria 1.2. So just before the release of the latest update, I did these two videos covering the original version of Terraria and also Terraria 1.1, but what I saw is a lot of requests to cover this update, 1.2. And I feel like that's because for a lot of people in the community, this is maybe the update that they remember the most, or maybe even the update that got them involved with Terraria, and I think of this one pretty fondly as well. So in this video, I'm going to show you my entire playthrough of Terraria 1.2, and along the way, I'm going to try point out as many things that are brand new, or things that I can remember that I think are interesting. And as you can see from looking down below, this video is a lot longer than some of the other projects I've put out on this channel. So I won't say it during the video, I'll get it out the way now. If you enjoyed today's video, please give the video a big fat thumbs up. I can't explain how much that helps. And if you enjoyed today's video, and by chance you are new, maybe consider clicking the subscribe button. Here on Chippy Gaming, I talk all things Terraria. So just for a little bit of context, we are playing the first ever public build of Terraria 1.2. This came out on September 30th of 2013, which means this year it'll be turning 7 years old. So for those who don't know, 1.2 is actually a very special update as it saw the revival of Terraria. Before this update, Terraria was actually officially cancelled, and then out of nowhere, Red started developing the game again. And 7 months later, we had an update as massive as this. And I'm going to talk about that quite a lot at the end. So, with that out the way, sit back, maybe grab some popcorn or a drink, because we're about to look at the entirety of Terraria 1.2. Let's begin. So, our adventure begins once again by creating a brand new character, and we can already see a new feature of 1.2 here, which is the color sliders. These were great at actually getting the color you really wanted, and I really liked it when they added this. Now, here's my 1.2 world. Now, when I think of a 1.2 world, I immediately think of these new tree variants. You see, the thing is, 1.2 added a bunch of different styles of trees, and I never really liked them. If I'm going to be honest with you, I'm really sorry. So I would often create brand new worlds to try and get the original trees right at the center. I know that's a little bit silly, but that's how it was. Now, 1.2 was special because it actually started using grass wall instead of dirt wall, and I think it made the world just look so much more brighter and much more vibrant, and I think it really helped with just building out the world a little bit more. 1.2 was also pretty great because it introduced ropes into the game. Ropes are something that if you don't have them, you can't live without. Yeah, big up ropes. So this is a very minor thing, but you can see here that I picked up the life crystal using my pickaxe. Now, if this was 1.1, I would have needed a hammer, but Terraria 1.2 changed a bunch of different tools, and I think it streamlined it to be a little bit better. So pretty quickly into my adventure, I found my very first gem cave, and I was a little bit surprised. They look a little bit different than I remember. And what's cool about 1.2 is it introduced the gem hooks. Gem hooks were great. I think most people can agree with that. Having to kill a piranha or a skeleton to get a hook in 1.1 was, you know, it was a bit tiresome. So this allowed you to get it even quicker. So I also went ahead and made a large sapphire. Now, for those who don't know, this was introduced for Capture the Gem. This was a little mini game that Terraria servers used to play back in the day. And it's strange looking back now that we have the Penguin minigame server, because looking at it now, Capture the Gem was really simple compared to what we can do. Not long after that, I found my very first accessory. This is the climbing claws. It was introduced in Terraria 1.2, and something that pops up probably more than it should do, let's be honest. So, not long after that, I got my first death. Unfortunately, I blew myself up with grenades. I wasn't trying to, just clicked the wrong button, but I actually left behind that large sapphire. Now, truth be told, I don't remember dropping it, and I completely forgot I made it, so looking at the footage now, it's kind of goofy. So I decided that it was probably about time to start building out my first NPC village. Terraria 1.2 added a lot of NPCs, so I needed to make sure I had a lot of different rooms for them. Now here's something that really caught me by surprise. So 1.2 added slopes, which I realized when playing 1.1, but what's interesting is that the usual slopes that I would add to my houses don't actually work in Terraria 1.2. That was kind of mind-blowing. When did they add the other slopes? No idea. So after my town was built and I had a bunch of rooms, I decided to head to the corruption. I didn't have any bombs at this point, but I remembered it was always a good idea to head there if you could to try and get some life crystals. However, I wasn't really expecting this, so I managed to find an enchanted sword on a stack of demonite right in the middle of the corruption. Is this a bug? Is this a feature? I don't know. But I'm going to be honest, it's nice to feel like Python and actually have access to this super early. The enchanted sword is great. So what's actually interesting about Terraria 1.2 is that it really redesigned the ice biome. For those that don't know, an ice biome was a 1 in 3 chance in the previous update, and it didn't have anything inside of it. It was just a big heap of snow. But 1.2 changed all of that, but we'll talk about that later. I also found one of these giant trees. Now, at this point in the game, you couldn't go inside of them. They were just there to be giant. Not long after, I managed to find my dungeon for the world. And what's interesting about playing these older versions is that every version I go to, it has a different dungeon. And this is something that's held up for many updates now. Inside though, no water bolt, so I headed back home. So once I headed back home, I actually saw that we had the brand new NPC, the painter. Now, if you've played Terraria, and I'm assuming you have, you'll know what the painter does. But yeah, paint was new in 1.2. So then I decided to make some Cactus Armor. Now, I've spoken about the concept art for 1.2 a few times, but I'm really glad that we could dress up as a cactus because we never got the cactus NPCs that we saw in the concept art, and I always felt that that was a bit of a miss. I would have loved to see it. So this really falls back into my usual playstyle, but now that I had some armor and a weapon to defend myself, I headed to the jungle. Now, the jungle had a big redesign in 1.2, especially in hard mode, but it introduced the spiked slime. I hate the spiked slime so much. The majority of my deaths in Terraria are 100% caused by these. Yeah, if we can remove these in Terraria 1.4.1, I wouldn't really complain. So, life in a 1.2 jungle is pretty similar to how it was in Terraria 1.3, maybe with a lot less shrines, especially in this world. Now, what's interesting here is that if you haven't noticed already, enemies now have a health bar underneath them. And what's actually funny is that worms in this update have a health bar for every single segment, and it looks pretty goofy. Try and keep an eye out for that because it pops up quite frequently. So since jungle armor is pretty cheap in Terraria 1.2, it doesn't require the silver armor or any use of gems. I did what I usually would, and I stuck inside the jungle for a pretty long time, just killing any enemies that I could see to get stingers and vines and spores, you know the drill. But I actually found my temple really quickly, and this reminded me of just a lot of 1.2 nostalgia, how it would be really cool to see the final dungeon in the game pretty early on, but you couldn't get inside. But we'll talk about that more right at the end. So throughout my jungle adventure, I'm collecting life crystals, I'm getting those spores like I mentioned. But one thing that made me nostalgic was actually draining out this little area that was full of water. I completely forgot just how slow and chuggy water used to look in Terraria. It just doesn't look right having looked at the Terraria 1.3 water for all these years. Really strange. So, once I headed back home, I saw that we had the brand new Dye Trader NPC. Now, he was added in so that players could dye their armor, because at this point, you wasn't actually able to see the player accessories. Only a few of them would show as vanity, and he didn't really sell much. I think most people can agree that the Dye Trader was pretty much placed on the back burner until strange plants were introduced. So it was now time to craft my jungle armor, but unfortunately, I didn't really have all the necessary ingredients. I assumed I had a lot more stingers than I did, so I ended up making the hat and pants. But what's really cool is that when I headed back to the jungle, I managed to pick up a piece of ancient Cobalt breastplate. Now, this was added in 1.2 as a little bit of fan service. For those that don't know, the original jungle armor was called Cobalt armor. It was then renamed jungle armor. And then in 1.2, to make it even more confusing, we got a new version of Cobalt armor, but only in hard mode. So I'm about 2 hours into my adventure now, and I managed to find my first golden chest inside of this house. Wow. I really thought 1.2 houses looked a lot better than they did. Definitely had some nostalgia goggles there. So I headed back home, and I decided to replace my sapphire hook with the ivy whip so that I had a little bit more movement. And then I needed a weapon. So I ended up making the Thorn Chakram, and I don't think I've really ever used this item in all the years I've played Terraria, but I'm going to be honest, it's kind of great. I've definitely slept on this one for a long time. So I thought at this point, I should probably just go and smash out the Eater of Worlds. I've got armor, I've got my boomerang, I'm probably going to be fine. But what's funny is that when I was getting ready to do the fight, I got the natural spawn for that Eye of Cthulhu. So just like I usually would, I headed up to the surface and made a small platform. So since this is the same Eye of Cthulhu that I fought in Terraria 1.1, there was no changes here. You know what happened? I took it down pretty easily. I was using my boomerang for the poison effect, and then I was also swapping back to a bunch of grenades that I bought, because I love grenades in Terraria. Honestly, they're pretty great. What I thought was interesting is that right at the very end of the fight, I went to put a torch on my platform. Yeah, can't do that yet. I don't know when they added that in, but it's so useful. So it's now time to take on the Eater of Worlds, and I did the same thing I usually would. I flattened out the area a little bit using some platforms, and I relied on bombs to break those orbs. What's cool is that the second I broke one of the orbs, a meteorite landed. So with the third shadow orb destroyed, it's now time for the Eater of Worlds. So you all know what happened here. It's the Eater of Worlds. It's been the same since the original version of the game. But what is new is that because he is a giant worm, every single segment has its own little health bar, which I still think is a little bit goofy, but I don't know. I kind of like it. I really like this boss fight in general. What's interesting is that I did keep looking on the brand new minimap to see where the boss was coming from, but in 1.2, that wasn't a thing yet. So after this, I decided to build a Elevator, and what's interesting is that in 1.2, we did have that like smart quick select when you press shift, but it didn't have that control option where it would actually do a little bit of auto mining for you. So I went back to doing the classic like moving your mouse backwards and forward movement, which I feel like a lot of OGs can really relate to. This was really fun to go back to. And then I found the flare gun. That's right, Python's favorite weapon, and in honor of him, I left it behind. Who needs it? Now, I need to ring Guinness about this one, but I'm pretty sure I found the world's smallest Terraria house, and inside was a pair of Hermes boots. So I managed to reach Hell, and this is where I feel like the majority of the nostalgia really flooded back in. I really like this version of Hell. I mean, the backgrounds that we've got in modern Terraria are honestly just so much better. But I really like these dark obsidian houses with these sprites and with these colors and with these lighting effects. This version of Hell is just, I just love it. It's absolutely great. I don't think I have a clip of it, but what's interesting is that when you stand on Hellstone in this update, it doesn't burn you. So navigating Hell is actually, gotta be honest, pretty easy, I would say. So before I moved on with my adventure, I really wanted either a cloud in a bottle or some kind of variant. So I decided to use some Spelunker potions and head underground. Now, can we take a big moment to appreciate just how good Spelunker potions used to be in Terraria 1.2? I want you to focus on a few things. Number one, look at how bright and vibrant the Spelunker potion is, but then take a little look at the fireworks display that is the minimap. It looks amazing. So like I mentioned, I was trying to find a cloud in a bottle. However, I decided that since I was making a retro video about Terraria 1.2, it didn't really seem very fitting, so I decided to take my Spelunker potion to the brand new revamped underground Ice Biome. To really show some love to this biome though, I think it's so impressive that in one update, this biome gets its own blocks, its own enemies, its own pots. It even gets accessories that help you navigate the biome because it introduced ice, and ice is a really fun mechanic in Terraria, one that I don't think gets enough love. Like, it's really cool to navigate on top of this crumbling ice. After not too long, I managed to find a new house, and inside was the Blizzard in a bottle. I really like all of the different bottle variants. This was something that started with 1.2, and the Blizzard in a bottle is definitely one of my favorites. So at this point, I had every accessory that I really wanted, so it's now time to take on the first of 3 new bosses that was added in Terraria 1.2, and this one is of course the Queen Bee. Now, please forgive me for my sins with this one. I managed to find a beehive pretty quickly, which I was very thankful of, because finding beehives in 1.2 could be a bit of a mixed bag. I actually made another world separate to this one, and I found 5 of them all attached together, and it was magnificent. But with this one, I just messed up, right? I was trying to make a really nice arena, and just out of nowhere, I broke the hive. And here's the queen bee. What do I have to fight it on? Well, just a bunch of sticky honey block, which is really hard to move on, let me say. So this was tragic. Thankfully, though, I did manage to recover, and I was able to put down some cactus block so that I was able to at least, you know, stand still and survive a little bit. So this is the same queen bee that we pretty much have in 1.4. However, one big change that we can mention is the loot that you get at the end. For those that don't know, the queen bee has the largest loot pool out of any boss in Terraria. She just has a bunch of drops that you can get. So I actually ended up getting the beekeeper, which is the bee sword. I also got the hive wand because, of course, hive and honey was all brand new in Terraria 1.2. And I got a couple of bee nades, and that's it. So no bee wax, which means I can't make more bee nades, I can't make the hornet staff, I can't make bee armor. All of that was added a couple of updates later. So without all that extra loot, I would say that the queen bee in Terraria 1.2, it's much more of a side optional boss than it's ever been. Of course, if you're playing 1.4 today and you want to do a summoner's run, the queen bee is essential, so it's nice to see that she got a lot of love down the road. So once that was done, it was now time to take on Skeletron. You all know the drill here. I built a nice long platform and then waited until nighttime. Now, during this fight, and not to get too self-indulgent, I really was hit with this big wave of achievement, as I was thinking about the fact that when I played this update all of those years ago, I had no idea that 7 years later, you'd be able to do this fight and you'd have a chance to get Chippy's couch. Still kind of mind-blowing. I'm so grateful for it. But yeah, every time I see this boss now, it just means so much to me. I mean, it meant a lot before with the cloth year and all that, but now it's really special. So I did get pretty lucky here, and I managed to get a new 1.2 weapon, the Book of Skulls. This was the first drop that they actually introduced for Skeletron, and it wasn't all that common. The funny thing is, I remember that when people used to talk about wanting an item from Skeletron, you would see a pretty big reaction of the Terraria community saying, no, he doesn't need an item. His item is that you get access to the dungeon. But yeah, we got the Book of Skulls, and I feel like the majority of people probably didn't use it, myself included, because you could go into the dungeon and go and grab yourself a water bolt. However, Book of Skulls, really good, and I used it a lot in hard mode, but we'll talk about that later. So we're just trying to grab a Cobalt shield at this point, pretty standard affair. I completely forgot until now, but they did make a change to magic missiles in this update. Pretty sure they just updated the texture and made them a little bit more fancy. I remember there was a lot of hype around that when I was talking about news back then. So finally, after doing all of that, I managed to get myself a natural goblin army spawn. I was really hoping I would get one before hard mode, because I just thought going into hard mode without any form of flight would be a bit of a nightmare. I'm definitely not a challenge YouTuber, and I have my crutches in Terraria, and I think flying is definitely one of them. Not too long after, I found the Goblin Tinkerer, and I was able to make the Spectre boots. Now, I didn't get the chance to make them in my gameplay, but they did actually add a new variant of boots, which we all know today as the Lightning boots. So 1.2 did a lot of this. It added in a lot of new combinations for accessories, and a lot of them were really useful, especially in hard mode. It's now Wall of Flesh time, and I'm pretty sure if you've watched any of my videos before, you know what method I used. That's right, I used the famous Uremia water walking potions in combination with the water bolt. That being said, Uremia, if you are listening, I'm waiting on my 1.4 videos. Where you at? Come on, I want to see what Uremia does with the Empress of Light. It needs to happen. So in 1.2, they didn't make any changes to the Wall of Flesh loot pool. They did actually add the Summoner's Emblem, but that was in a couple of updates, and I'm hoping in the future we can make a retro video about those updates as well. So with my Warrior's Emblem, I was now ready for hard mode. Today's video is once again proudly sponsored by Raycon. So Raycon, if you've never heard me talk about them, is a brand that was started by Ray J, and what they aim to do is create a true wireless earbud that sounds just as good as some of the other premium brands you've probably heard of, but they literally cost half the price. So I've been using the everyday E25s for a good couple of months now, and at first I was using them a lot for just walks and such, but they've become really handy for me. So the bulk of today's video was actually filmed outside in my garden, enjoying some socially distanced sun. And these were great because I didn't really want Terraria's music blasting out to all my neighbors that were doing their gardening. So once I had connected them up, they were really useful. So they come in this nice little recharging case, and this is what they look like when they're in. So when they're in, they have 6 hours of battery life. Now, I got mine in white, but you can actually get them in a variety of different colors, and I'm not going to lie, they kind of look good no matter what you choose. So if you do want to be like me and you want to pick up a pair of these, you can go to www.buyraycon.com/chipping and you can save 15%, and I'll leave a link to that down below too. So once again, thank you to Raycon for sponsoring yet another video on the channel. It means a lot. Thanks for coming back. And with that out of the way, let's go back to Terraria 1.2. Alright, welcome back to Terraria. So now that we're in hard mode, it's time to find out what ore variants we have. 1.2 famously added in palladium, orichalcum, and titanium. We ended up getting cobalt, orichalcum, and adamantite, which is pretty good. I mean, titanium is clearly the better one though, so that would have been a little bit better, but it's fine. And you know the drill here. We got to get the cobalt pickaxe, we got to get the orichalcum pickaxe, and then you can finally mine adamantite. So this process was a little bit faster than 1.1, but I will say whenever I sit down and I record these giant Terraria sessions, this part of the mining is the part of the game that I actually don't like. It's really grindy, but what's great is that in 1.4, and this was fixed in 1.3 as well, there are so many different options that you can have before you take on the mechanical bosses. It's just that in 1.2 and in 1.1, this was really your only option because we hadn't had the Summoners class, and yeah, it just takes forever. It really does. Like, mining all the ores and stuff takes like 2-3 hours. It's not for me. So around this point as well, I actually started to miss planter boxes. So in this version, you had to make these clay pots, and that's how you'd grow all your herbs. This is what I do because I want to get a bunch of Spelunker potions. And I also missed the change to the Staff of Regrowth. That happened in 1.3, and it made collecting herbs just so much easier. But this is the little farm that I ended up with. So like I mentioned earlier, the Book of Skulls is actually really powerful, and I wanted to dedicate a section to actually showing how I used it quite a lot when I was in early hard mode. And obviously, surviving early hard mode, it isn't the easiest thing, especially back when you didn't have so many weapons to use straight out the gate. So I used the Book of Skulls a lot. Now, for this part of my adventure, I basically focused on getting as many souls as possible. If I could get some cursed flames, I would. The reason I'm doing this is basically just to bulk up on ingredients. I'd really like to make some hard mode weapons, and of course, I'd like to take on the mech bosses. And for both of those, I'm going to need ingredients. So I did manage to find a KO cannon. Now, I want to put forward the argument that this is probably one of the most forgotten items in Terraria, and definitely something that nobody has ever sought out. Have you ever known a player to go, you know what I really want? I want the KO cannon. I mean, it is kind of comical, but I even forget it's in the game at this point. So like I mentioned earlier, Terraria 1.2 added in a bunch of new combinations for accessories, and I was able to make the new one, the Charm of Myths, which is something that I really enjoy even in modern Terraria. So being a little lazy, I decided to use a small exploit to try and get a bunch of Souls of Light all at once. So I decided to use the old reliable King Slime method. But it turns out in 1.2, he won't spawn underground. I don't remember this being a thing, but it's kind of a thing. This was actually the only slimy crown that I made in 1.2 because this was before they made them super cheap in 1.3. So in this playthrough, I never killed the King Slime. So 1.2 added in the Rod of Discord, and I really wanted to get my hands on one of these. So I decided to set aside an hour of my time to check out the Hallowed Biome and really try and get one, because if I remember correctly, when they first added them, they didn't have a cooldown effect. So you could spam it to your heart's content and completely break the game. I was desperate for one, but really unfortunately, I just wasn't able to get one. They were super rare then, and they're still super rare now, but I completely understand why. Now, I'll talk more about the hard mode jungle later on when we discuss Plantera, but I did head there really quickly, and I managed to find the wizard. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the wizard was able to sell me a spell tomb so that I was able to make the Cursed Flames. The Cursed Flames is just such a great weapon, and it's actually been buffed quite recently as well, so it's even better. This is the last weapon that I would ever need to make in this adventure, because the Cursed Flames will carry you from the beginning of hard mode all the way up past Golem. It's really that good. Give it a try if you haven't used it in a while. So with my new weapon, it was back to mining adamantite. Yeah, I took a big break on mining it because, like I mentioned, it just takes way too long to get hard mode ores. It really drags the game down. Honestly, so glad that that isn't a thing. And then I found an absolute icon of 1.2, the Rune Wizard. I forgot they added this, and I love the Rune Wizard. So this is the hard mode upgrade to Tim. I remember the community was absolutely desperate for this, and the Rune Wizard outfit is just such a symbolic outfit from 1.2. The funny thing is it's so broken because the sprite will actually show the armor underneath. But we're going to look past that, but I will talk about that at the very end of the video. So we are very almost ready for the mechanical bosses, but I'm going to need a set of wings. Now you may remember that in Terraria 1.1, it was a bit of a faff to get a set of wings. You needed to do a lot of grinding, but 1.2 introduced the leaf wings, and I think we all know where this is heading. So what I decided to do in this update is actually mine just a bunch of ore. I went for Cobalt, I also went for Orichalcum, and that was my main money making method. So once we returned home, I saw that we had the brand new Party Girl NPC. And just to spout some quick fun facts for those that don't know, the Party Girl is actually Red's favorite NPC, or it was when he last spoke about it. And this is probably why it appears in Red's Seed, or as the community now call it, the Drunk Seed. So the Party Girl will sell a bunch of party stuff, you know, confetti and rockets and fireworks. These were what actually added up to the 1000th item in Terraria. So they celebrated the 1000th item with fireworks and they posted it, and it's a pretty iconic 1.2 spoiler. She's also a reference to My Little Pony. I'm sure most of you know that. After selling a bunch of ores, I now had 1 platinum, so I moved my Witch Doctor into the jungle. I waited until nighttime and I bought a set of leaf wings. This really is an improvement over 1.1, which, like I mentioned, made getting wings a bit of a faff. Here all you needed to do was just save up and be a little bit smart with your money, and you could get a set of wings. They were actually better than the wings that were introduced in 1.1. Now that I have a full set of armor and a set of wings, it's now time for the Destroyer. But before I take it on, I managed to find an absolute banger of a 1.2 weapon, the Nimbus Rod. I didn't speak about this at the start, but 1.2 added the rain mechanic. So whenever it rained, the screen got a little bit darker and new enemies showed up. And the best thing that you could get from this was by far the Nimbus Rod. So when you pair the Nimbus Rod and the Destroyer together, you just get an absolute killer combination. When you're playing Expert or Master mode, you know, it's not that great anymore, but in normal mode, it's just brilliant. So it's the same Destroyer fight that we all know, so I'm going to skip over it as well. Shout out to all the people that can remember the absolute confusion you would have when you kill a mech boss, but you have no idea where the loot went. I was lucky and found mine pretty quick, but yeah, usually it's like buried underground or something. I'm glad Terraria fixed that. So I decided to take a little look at my hallowed bars in case I was forgetting any of the crafting recipes. And it turns out that in Terraria 1.2, you can make the pickaxe axe only using hallowed bars. You don't need any of the souls from any of the mech bosses. And this completely throws off the progression of Terraria. I don't think I ever really used this back in the day. So with the pickaxe axe, it means that you can go and mine chlorophyte straight away. Whereas in modern Terraria, you need to make sure you've killed all of the mech bosses beforehand. So I think it's now time to talk about the hard mode jungle, because this was a pretty big feature of Terraria 1.2. So in hard mode jungle, they actually added in a bunch of new enemies that just weren't in the game before, and they also added in a lot of incentives to come here. Of course you had that chlorophyte, but the game also offered life fruit, so you can now upgrade your health from 400 to 500. I think the enemy that most people remember from this time is the jungle turtles. These were very aggressive, especially in 1.2. They slowed them down a little bit after this, but they would just come hurling from completely off the screen and take you out. Now, since I was already here mining chlorophyte, I decided to give a big chunk of time to building a Plantera arena. And of course, Plantera is another very large part of that big hard mode jungle upgrade. So building a Plantera arena in 1.2 is the exact same as you would do it today. You basically build out a giant rectangle, and hopefully, you know, in modern Terraria, you have some summons to help you out. I just had my Nimbus Rod, but my Nimbus Rod did amazing. Because I had it placed over some jungle water, it basically meant that I was farming out a bunch of these jungle fish. A lot of people use these in AFK farms. And one thing I really miss about 1.2 is the fact that items didn't really group together all that well. So you would go over a big pile of items and it would just feel like completely different. So after my jungle experience was over, I decided to make the mana flower. This is an accessory that I don't often make. I usually rely on mana regen. But since mana regen potions only last 2 minutes in this update, it seemed pretty essential. And then unintentionally, I actually found the biggest bit of cheese, because it turns out that mana sickness just wasn't a thing in Terraria 1.2, which means that if you're playing as a mage, if you have the right mana potions, you can essentially fire off forever with no penalty. So that's exactly what I did. Now, Skeletron Prime here is the exact same as we saw it in Terraria 1.2, so we're going to skip over that again. What I did really like about this fight though is that the Nimbus Rod was still super useful. Once I destroyed all of the arms, I had a nice little pillar of Nimbus Rod rain, and that really helped with the mechanical skull. So since I'd already gathered a good amount of it, and apparently because it's a feature in Terraria 1.2, I decided to make a full set of chlorophyte armor. And this felt real good. I can remember back when 1.2 came out, it's always a really good feeling when an update adds in a new higher tier than what you're used to. With 1.1, we had the feeling of hallowed armor, and here we had chlorophyte, and also a bunch of variants that I didn't end up making, but chlorophyte's the real selling point. So earlier, I managed to find an enchanted sword, which is something that I rarely ever find, and then I found something else that I also rarely ever find, a beam sword. So I'm beginning to think that this world, it might just be blessed. So it's finally time for the twins, and like I said with some of the other boss fights, there's nothing really new to show here, so we're going to skip over it. But I will say, fighting the twins using the 720p resolution was a lot of fun. It brought back a lot of nostalgia. This is the resolution that I used to play 1.2 in because I didn't have a monitor that supported 1080p. With all the mechanical bosses out the way, the world is now growing Plantera bulbs. But what I found interesting is that just before I did the Plantera fight, I actually found a naturally spawning red hat, since one of the mech bosses did in fact kill my Clothier. So here we go, I'm completing the classic 1.2 look on the channel with chlorophyte armor and a red hat. So going into 1.2, I fully expected to have a part of this video where I ranted a little bit about how infrequent Plantera bulbs used to spawn, but I actually found my Plantera bulb in a couple of minutes after defeating the final mech boss, so no real complaints, but I guess that's just RNG. Now let's talk about Plantera, because wow, she is a lot quicker in Terraria 1.2, and I completely forgot just how much they've nerfed this fight since its original version. So exactly a month after this update, they released a small patch which nerfed Plantera quite a bit, and they did this by reducing Plantera's speed. Now, Plantera's speed is not only seen in the fact that she moves across the screen quite fast, but also how quickly she moves around those hooks. I actually found that speed increase to be a lot more fun as you try and coax Plantera into your arena. When she's moving that fast, it feels like, you know, your chances of surviving before getting there are a little bit slimmer, so I like that aspect. So for this first phase though, all I'm really doing is what I would normally do. I'm circling the boss, I'm using my weapon from a good distance. So as we move into the second half, you can really see the side effects of that nerf. You can see that the hooks are moving a lot faster and a lot shorter than they do in modern Terraria. It's almost like looking at a modded version of the fight, or maybe even an enraged version. But I actually really like this challenge because I feel like modern Plantera, I'm going to be honest, I think it's a little bit on the easy side now. Usually, if you've got a decent sized arena, you're probably not going to run into any issues with Plantera. Maybe if you're playing Master Mode or the Further Worthy Seed, it's a little bit harder. But I would say, maybe let's bring this speed increase back. I kind of like this version of Plantera. So, by defeating Plantera, I was able to get myself a grenade launcher. Of course, a new weapon in Terraria 1.2. One that is actually tied to a new NPC as well, called the Cyborg. But most importantly, I got the temple key, which is basically the gateway to your final little challenge when you used to play Terraria 1.2. So having seen the temple throughout my adventure, every time I went to the jungle, it felt very satisfying to finally open that door. And what greeted me was just a regular Terraria temple. You know the drill, there's traps that you don't want to activate, there's lizards that you kind of want to get out of the way of. But what most people do, and what you should probably do if you ever go to the temple, is basically just lock yourself in the final room, because it's time for your fight against Golem. Now, in Terraria 1.2, Golem was the final boss fight, which is pretty strange to think about, because Golem is probably by far one of the easiest bosses in Terraria. So I ended up blocking myself in the final room, killing all the enemies. But wait, there's a bit of a problem. My world didn't spawn the altar that you actually need to fight Golem. So this actually was a common issue with this version of Terraria. And then about a week later, they fixed it. But that's not the version I'm playing. So in this version, it is impossible to fight Golem. So after that small disappointment, I decided to go and check out the hard mode dungeon. Now, in modern Plantera, the dungeon isn't actually hard mode until you've taken down Plantera. But in this build of the game, this is how it is from the moment that you enter hard mode. So if you had the skills, you could technically come here and grab yourself a bunch of the new weapons. So in this build of Terraria 1.2, the hard mode dungeon is kind of like getting a weapon from the Moon Lord. It's really exciting and it's very powerful, but you don't really have anything to use it on. So this is why I would pretty much always skip the hard mode dungeon when I used to play 1.2. But it's good to see that all of the enemies that we now know and love are actually all here, as well as those special backgrounds that determined what enemies would spawn. You could find stuff like the Hell Armored Skeletons, you could find Bone Lees. 1.2 had Paladins, it had a bunch of great stuff, and I feel like this is probably one of the highlights for me looking back now, because hard mode dungeon is kind of core to what became the end game post 1.3. So thankfully, alongside the Golem bug, there is actually a bit of an oversight with Terraria 1.2, and that is the fact that you can actually actuate yourself into the temple, even though it's a brand new world, and you can go ahead and pick up that altar and then bring it back to your world. Alright, so let's round up this 30-hour project by taking on the 1.2 version of Golem. Now, Golem is a fight that I rag on quite a lot. I've always thought it's a little bit too easy. I kind of fall into the camp that if you can defeat Plantera, you've already defeated Golem. But I often see people say that they actually made Golem a lot easier with some of the patches that followed. I'm here to tell you that it's always been easy. Trust me, they made it harder, but it's always been really easy. So in this version, one of the best parts is that its fists won't actually go through platforms. So a cool little trick that you could use back in the day is by placing a platform throughout the middle of the arena, you can basically just cut out half the fight. So for the first phase, all you're really doing is dodging a fireball, and then once that's out the way, in the second part, all you really have to do is fly up and down, avoid a laser beam and a fireball, but that's a lot less than you would have to deal with if you were doing Plantera. So, with Golem defeated, my 1.2 adventure has now come to an end. So, having played this update again 7 years after it's come out, I do actually have some closing thoughts that I want to talk about. But for those wondering, I ended up getting the Heat Ray. I always really liked the fact that this added a little bit of back bling to your character whenever you used it, although I'll be honest, I never really used it. Hey, you made it to the end of my adventure. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed this super long video. So I wanted to share some quick thoughts about 1.2 that I thought about while actually recording all this gameplay. I'd never really put these dots together before, so I don't know if they come across as kind of mad, I don't know. So I think looking back, Terraria 1.2 was very special. It has the shortest development time out of any of the major updates, and I really feel like with that time, it was all about pushing content before anything else. So this update obviously added in the hard mode jungle, it had the hard mode dungeon, a bunch of new armor sets, a bunch of new classes, a bunch of new weapons, enemies, you know the drill. But with that being said, it also lacks a lot of the polish that Relogic are probably known for in 2020. When I was looking back at this, I could see a bunch of classic sprites, and it made me think about the fact that even with 1.4, they are still correcting a few of the mistakes that pop up in this update, especially in regards to stuff like balancing. We saw changes to titanium armor, but I really feel like in 2013, at the point where the community was dying off following Terraria's cancellation, we needed a 1.2 and not a 1.4, if that makes sense. We needed content first and then polish later, and I'm just so glad that we got 1.2. Alright, so that's really going to wrap it up. By chance, if you did make it to the very end of the video and you haven't already, make sure to give the video a big fat thumbs up, and if you are new around here, maybe consider clicking the subscribe button. Alright, see you in the next one, guys. Peace.